If you watched the NBA in the 90s, you remember the feeling. The broadcast theme hits, the camera pans across a roaring arena, and you just know something wild is about to happen. One fast break, one leap, one rim-shaking moment that makes you yell at the TV like the players can hear you. Now imagine this, a man built like a spring, an athlete who seemed to hang in the air longer than physics allowed, rises in Seattle and becomes one of the most electrifying finishers the league has ever seen. A fan favorite, a nightly highlight, a walking "did you see that?" clip, the kind of player who didn't just score, he performed. And then the story flips. The same name that once meant pure excitement starts showing up in a very different kind of conversation. Money problems, heavy obligations, a body that looks nothing like the one that used to fly, and whispers that the real battle was never only on the court. Not one mistake, not one bad season. A chain reaction, one choice feeding the next until the spotlight turns harsh. Tonight, we're pulling that chain apart link by link. Because Shawn Kemp's story isn't just a superstar who fell off, it's a case study in how fast fame moves, how loud the applause gets, and how quietly the consequences pile up when the cameras stop rolling. So let me ask you right away, because I want you involved in this from the first minute. Do you believe a star's downfall is mostly on him? Or do you think the system, the money, and the people around him help push the dominoes? And another one, if you were in Shawn Kemp's shoes, young, gifted, and suddenly rich, do you think you'd make better choices? Be honest, drop your answer in the comments as we go, because by the end of this, you're going to have a strong opinion. And you might even change it halfway through. One more promise. We're not doing vague storytelling. We're doing receipts, draft position, season numbers, playoff results, and the moments that were so big they became part of NBA folklore. And it all starts with a risk. Because before Shawn Kemp became Rain Man, before the dunks became a weekly TV event, he was a gamble, taken with a very specific pick on a very specific night. And Seattle took that gamble anyway. If you only remember Shawn Kemp from the TV era, those wide shots, that grainy 90s glow, the crowd rising before the ball even hits the rim, you probably remember him as unstoppable. And for stretches he was. Shawn Kemp wasn't the kind of player who needed a complicated setup. Give him space near the lane, give him one step, and suddenly he's above everyone. His game was built for television, fast breaks, power finishes, and the kind of aggression that made defenses look like they were reacting in slow motion. But here's the secret that makes this story so haunting. The same traits that made him thrilling, impulse, intensity, appetite for the big moment, could also turn into danger when life got complicated. Because fame doesn't arrive alone. It shows up with an entourage. It shows up with spending, with attention, with temptations, with pressure, with the sense that the rules apply to everyone else. And Shawn Kemp's life, especially as the years went on, started to look like two different broadcasts running at the same time. On the court, a man chasing greatness, a symbol of the Seattle SuperSonics at their loudest and most confident. Off the court, a growing list of obligations and choices that didn't just follow him, they cornered him. Now, I'm going to be careful with how we talk about sensitive topics tonight, because this isn't about shock, it's about understanding. But we can't tell the truth of Shawn Kemp without acknowledging that there were years when people around the league believed he was struggling with harmful habits, things that can quietly reshape a career long before the box score makes it obvious. And the most painful part is this. When the public sees the fall, they think it happens overnight. It almost never does. It usually begins when you're still winning. It begins when the checks get bigger, when the headlines get friendlier, when you start to believe your own myth. So here's your first choose a side moment. Do you think a player like Shawn Kemp was doomed the moment fame and money hit at full speed? Or do you believe discipline alone can beat any temptation? Type it out. I want to see where you stand before the evidence starts piling up. Because the evidence starts with a simple fact, one that sounds innocent, but changes everything when you think about it. Shawn Kemp didn't enter the NBA as a sure thing. He entered as a bet, and Seattle placed it with the 17th pick in the first round of the 1989 NBA draft. That detail matters because it tells you what the league thought of him at the time. Talent, yes, but questions too. That draft information is widely documented in historical records and summaries of the 1989 class. And that's where our investigation truly begins. Because if you understand why he was a gamble, you understand why the story turns the way it does later. And in the next chapter, we're going to step into that draft night and show you what Seattle saw, what they ignored, and what they couldn't possibly predict. Draft night in the late 80s had its own kind of drama. No social media storms. No instant hot takes in your pocket. Back then, the narrative was shaped by TV panels, local sports radio, and the morning paper. You'd watch the commissioner, watch the suits on stage, and you'd wait, sometimes for hours, to find out if your team just got a future star or a future regret. In 1989, the Seattle SuperSonics were sitting there with a first-round pick, number 17, and a problem every front office knows too well. Do you choose the safe player who looks polished? Or do you choose raw talent so explosive it could change your franchise? Seattle chose the explosive one. They chose Shawn Kemp. Now let's be clear. Being drafted 17th isn't an insult. It's still the first round. It's still a major investment. But it does tell you something about the scouting world at the time. Kemp wasn't universally viewed as a guaranteed star. He was viewed as a player with massive upside and real risk. And in the NBA, that combination is like gasoline. If it catches fire, it lights up the league. If it doesn't, it burns the team that gambled. So what were the expectations? Seattle wasn't drafting a ready-made franchise savior. They were drafting potential, an athlete who could become a human highlight factory, a force in the paint, an energy player who could evolve into a star if everything broke right. And for a while, everything did break right. But here's the question nobody wants to ask on draft night, because it feels negative. It feels like you're spoiling the party. What happens when a player gets paid and praised before he's fully built the habits to handle it? That's the hidden theme of Shawn Kemp's story. The league loved what he could do physically. The fans loved what he could do emotionally because he made them feel something. But the NBA, especially in that era, also had a harsh side. A side where the schedule is relentless, the travel is brutal, and the pressure is constant. A side where the wrong circle of people can drain you faster than any defender. And Seattle, a city hungry for a true superstar moment, was about to hand Kemp the stage. Now I want you to imagine the scene like it looked back then. You're a Sonics fan. Maybe you've got the game on in the living room. Maybe it's on in a bar with neon beer signs buzzing. The TV is slightly fuzzy, the colors are a little washed, but the feeling is crystal clear. This could be the guy. And soon he was, because once he hit the floor, Shawn Kemp didn't just play. He announced himself. But before we get to the famous partnership, before we get to the finals run, we need to talk about how Seattle shaped him and how the league reacted when they realized this risk was turning into a monster. So let's lock in your vote before we move on. If you're a general manager, do you prefer the safe pick, or do you swing for the player who could change your franchise in one leap? Comment, safe or swing. No middle answers. Because next chapter we're going straight into his early NBA years, how the Sonics built his role, how the highlight machine started, and how the first cracks were already forming in the background. Even while the crowd was cheering. And trust me, when you hear how fast his rise happened, you'll understand why the fall later was so violent. Here's something people forget about the early years of Shawn Kemp. He wasn't handed the keys to the franchise on day one. He had to grow into the spotlight. When Kemp entered the league in 1989, the Seattle SuperSonics didn't immediately build the offense around him. They didn't treat him like a finished product. He was raw, powerful, unpredictable. And in those early seasons, his role was simple: run hard, crash the glass, finish with authority. But even in that limited role, the numbers started whispering. In his rookie season, Kemp averaged just over 6 points per game and a little under 5 rebounds. Nothing that would scare the league, nothing that would make front-page headlines. But if you looked closer, if you watched the games instead of the stat sheet, you saw something different. You saw energy. You saw a forward who could outrun bigger players and overpower smaller ones. You saw a body built for contact and a mindset that wasn't afraid of it. And by his third season, the progression became impossible to ignore. His scoring climbed into double digits, his rebounding improved, his minutes increased. The coaching staff began trusting him in critical stretches. Seattle was careful, but not slow. By the early 1990s, Kemp was averaging over 15 points and around 10 rebounds per game in a season. That's not a role player. That's a core piece. And by the mid-90s, he would peak around 20 points and nearly 11 rebounds per game during one of his strongest campaigns. Let me pause and ask you something. When you think about player development, what impresses you more? An instant superstar from year one, or a guy who climbs step by step until suddenly he's undeniable? Because Kemp's rise wasn't overnight hype. It was a steady build that exploded at the right moment. But here's the detail that matters for our story. As his numbers rose, so did his status. As his status rose, so did the lifestyle. And as the lifestyle expanded, so did the pressure. Seattle fans loved him. The arena fed off him. Those breakaway dunks, they weren't just 2 points, they were psychological statements. The crowd would stand before he even landed. If you watched NBA broadcasts in the early to mid-90s, you remember how highlights were packaged, slow motion, dramatic music, studio analysts shaking their heads. And Kemp fit that format perfectly. He wasn't just productive, he was cinematic. But cinematic careers often burn bright and fast. And as the Sonics started realizing they had something special, another piece was falling into place. A guard with a voice loud enough to match Kemp's game. That's when things went from promising to dangerous. Because once Gary Payton fully emerged, Seattle didn't just have talent, they had chemistry. And sometimes chemistry is rocket fuel. So here's your next vote. Do you think athletic dominance alone wins championships, or does a team always need that loud, demanding floor general to turn talent into trophies? Because in the next chapter, we're talking about one of the most electric duos of the 90s, the partnership that turned Shawn Kemp into a national phenomenon. And that partnership would take them all the way to the biggest stage in basketball. But it would also amplify every crack in the foundation. If you watched the NBA in the mid-90s, you didn't need advanced analytics to know something was happening in Seattle. You just felt it. Gary Payton brought intensity, defense, swagger. He talked constantly to opponents, to referees, sometimes to teammates. He was the engine that never cooled down. Shawn Kemp was the explosion at the end of the play. Pick and roll, one hard dribble, lob, boom. It became a ritual. By the 1995-96 season, the Seattle SuperSonics weren't just good, they were elite. They finished that regular season with 64 wins. 64. That was the best record in franchise history at the time. That wasn't a cute playoff team, that was a contender. Kemp that year averaged around 19 points and over 10 rebounds per game, anchoring the interior. Payton ran the perimeter. And together, they built one of the most exciting teams the league had seen outside of Chicago. And remember, this was the era of physical basketball, hand-checking, hard fouls, no easy lanes. The league was, as many fans still say, tougher, louder, less forgiving. So when Seattle started stacking wins, people noticed. But with success comes expectation. 64 wins isn't just a stat. It's a target painted on your back. And the playoffs? That's where myths are tested. Let me ask you something directly. When a team dominates the regular season like that, do you consider anything less than a championship a failure? Because that's the standard Seattle walked into the postseason with. And this is where Shawn Kemp truly elevated his reputation. In the Western Conference playoffs, he delivered. Strong rebounding, efficient scoring, energy that never dipped. In key matchups, including intense series battles, Kemp showed he wasn't just a dunker, he was a force. By the time Seattle reached the NBA Finals in 1996, the entire country was watching. And standing on the other side, the Chicago Bulls, a 72-win machine, a dynasty in full control. You could almost hear the commentators setting it up, the established kings versus the rising challengers. And here's what most people don't remember clearly enough. In Game 1 of that final series, Shawn Kemp scored 32 points, 32, on the biggest stage. He attacked relentlessly. He didn't look intimidated. He looked ready. But the Bulls won that game. And that right there is the cruel twist of sports history. You can have the night of your life and still walk off the floor defeated. Seattle ultimately lost the series 4-2. Now I want you to think carefully about this next question. If a player performs brilliantly in the finals but doesn't win the championship, does history treat him fairly? Or does it quietly downgrade him forever? Because that loss didn't just end a season. It changed the direction of Shawn Kemp's career in ways most fans didn't fully understand at the time. And here's where it gets complicated. After reaching the mountain, instead of building a dynasty, cracks started forming. Money conversations, contract tensions, personal pressures, the kind of behind-the-scenes friction that rarely makes it into highlight reels. And in the next chapter, we're stepping into that turning point, what happens after you come this close to glory. And don't grab it. Because for Shawn Kemp, the aftermath of the 1996 finals was not a continuation of success. It was the beginning of something else entirely. There's something psychologically brutal about losing a championship series. If you get swept early in the playoffs, you regroup, you retool. You say, we weren't ready. But when you reach the finals and fall short, that stays with you. Seattle had just completed a 64-win season. They pushed Chicago. They showed flashes of brilliance. But they still walked away without the trophy. And from that moment on, the narrative shifted. Instead of the exciting young contender, they became the team that couldn't finish. And Shawn Kemp felt it. You could see it in the expectations placed on him the following season. You could see it in how analysts talked about him. The margin for error shrank. The grace period disappeared. Then came the business side, contract talks, salary comparisons, questions about value. Eventually, Kemp was traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers in a blockbuster deal. And with that move came a massive contract, reported at around 7 years and over $100 million. In the late 90s, that wasn't just big money, that was generational money. Now pause for a second. If you were 20-something years old and handed over $100 million, would that sharpen your focus or test it? Because this is where the two Shawn Kemp story intensifies. The Cleveland chapter began with promise, fresh start, new city, big contract, high expectations. But it also came with weight. And I don't just mean metaphorical weight. During the 1998-99 lockout season, the NBA schedule was disrupted. The rhythm of training and competition was broken. And when Kemp reported to camp, multiple reports indicated he had gained significant weight, often cited around 35 pounds heavier than his listed playing weight. For a player whose game depended on explosion, lift, and speed, that's devastating. You can't outrun defenders the same way. You can't elevate as easily. You can't dominate the paint with the same ferocity. And suddenly, the narrative changed again. From Rain Man to What Happened, his production dipped, his dominance faded, and whispers about personal struggles, about lifestyle, about habits, grew louder in sports media circles. Now I'm going to ask you something uncomfortable. Do you think the lockout was the turning point? Or do you believe the decline had already started before that break? Because the truth usually isn't one dramatic moment. It's a series of small ones, a missed workout, a late night, a financial obligation that grows, a stress that doesn't leave. And by the early 2000s, Shawn Kemp was no longer the player who once terrified defenders in the finals. He had flashes, but the sustained dominance? Gone. And this is where our story takes a deeper turn. Because beyond basketball, beyond the contract, beyond the weight and the whispers, there was another force reshaping his life, financial pressure tied to personal decisions. Multiple reports over the years described Kemp as having 7 children with 6 different women. That reality carries emotional and financial responsibility. And those responsibilities don't pause when your jump shot fades. So let me ask you plainly, is it fair to judge an athlete purely by performance without considering the personal weight he's carrying behind the scenes? Or is that part of the professional bargain? Because in the next chapters, we're diving directly into that financial spiral, how massive earnings can evaporate, how obligations multiply, and how reputation can shift from highlight hero to cautionary tale. And once we get there, you might see the entire career arc differently. Let's talk about the number that changed everything: 7 years. Over $100 million. In today's NBA, that's almost routine for a franchise star. But in the late 1990s, that kind of deal put you in a different universe. You weren't just an athlete. You were a walking enterprise. When Shawn Kemp signed that massive contract with Cleveland, it was framed as validation. Proof that he had arrived. Proof that the finals run wasn't a fluke. Proof that his explosive style had real value. But here's the uncomfortable truth about big contracts. They don't just raise your bank balance, they raise your exposure, your expectations, your obligations, your circle. And in Kemp's case, that circle got very expensive. Over time, reports repeatedly referenced that he had 7 children with 6 different women. That means long-term financial commitments, child support, housing arrangements, legal coordination, ongoing responsibilities that don't shrink when your playing time does. Now think about the structure of NBA earnings. A contract may be worth over $100 million on paper, but after taxes, agent fees, lifestyle costs, and support obligations, the real take-home number is far smaller. Add in business ventures, property, cars, family, and a growing entourage, and the pressure multiplies. And here's the psychological trap. When you're earning that kind of money, you start living as if it will always be there. But athletic prime is temporary. Let me ask you directly. Do you believe most young stars are truly prepared for that level of wealth? Or does the league hand them the keys before they've built the discipline to manage it? Because by the early 2000s, the whispers weren't just about performance anymore, they were about finances. Stories circulated suggesting Kemp had lost large portions of his earnings. Some media outlets framed it as bankruptcy. Others described it more cautiously as severe financial strain. What matters isn't the sensational headline. What matters is the pattern. High income, heavy obligations, performance decline, reduced contracts later in career. That combination is dangerous, and it wasn't happening in isolation. At the same time the financial pressure was rising, something else was shifting dramatically, the body that once defined him. And when an athlete whose game is built on explosion loses even 10% of that lift, the impact is brutal. So here's your next call. Is financial collapse more about poor decisions or about being surrounded by people who benefit when you overspend? Because the next chapter isn't about rumors, it's about numbers. We're going to compare peak Shawn Kemp with post-lockout Shawn Kemp, and the difference is sharper than most fans remember. This might be the most revealing chapter of all. Because when debates get emotional, numbers bring clarity. Let's go back to the mid-90s, his peak years in Seattle. In the 1995-96 season, Kemp averaged roughly 19 points and over 10 rebounds per game. He was efficient near the rim. He ran the floor hard. He was selected as an all-star multiple times during that stretch. He was explosive and consistent. That version of Shawn Kemp was feared. Now let's jump forward to the post-lockout Cleveland period. During the 1998-99 lockout season, reports widely stated that he arrived at training camp approximately 30 to 35 pounds heavier than his listed playing weight. For a 6'10" forward whose advantage was speed and vertical lift, that isn't cosmetic, it's structural, and the numbers reflect it. Scoring efficiency dropped, defensive mobility slowed, rebounding impact became less dominant. Instead of flying above defenders, he often looked grounded. Now, here's something subtle but important. He still had seasons where he averaged respectable numbers. He wasn't suddenly a bench player overnight. But the aura, the intimidation factor, the fear he created in transition, that faded. And in professional sports, once fear disappears, your margin shrinks dramatically. Let me challenge you here. If a player loses athletic explosiveness, can skill alone carry him through? Or was Kemp's game too dependent on physical dominance to survive that drop? Because this is where the debate gets serious. Was the weight gain the cause of decline? Or was it a symptom of deeper issues, stress, lifestyle imbalance, personal struggles, the psychological weight of expectations? The lockout itself disrupted routine. No structured season, no daily team environment. For disciplined veterans, that break can be manageable. For players already juggling heavy off-court pressure, it can be destabilizing. And this is where the conversation about harmful habits enters the picture. Over the years, several reports suggested that Kemp struggled with destructive lifestyle patterns. These reports were never part of a single defining scandal during his peak, but they lingered. They resurfaced in later coverage. And in the world of sports media, once that narrative begins, it sticks. So I'll ask you something that fans rarely admit out loud. Do you think the media sometimes locks onto a decline narrative and refuses to let it go? Or do you believe where there's smoke, there's usually fire? Because in the next chapter, we're diving directly into how the media portrayed him, and how the story of Rain Man gradually turned into a cautionary tale. And once that shift happens publicly, it's almost impossible to reverse. There's a difference between a slump and a storyline. A slump is temporary. A storyline becomes identity. By the early 2000s, sports coverage of Shawn Kemp began focusing less on dunks and more on concerns: weight, conditioning, commitment, personal life, financial strain. Once those themes enter the public conversation, they overshadow everything else. Even when he had strong games, the narrative didn't change. And this is the brutal side of fame. The same media machine that elevated him in Seattle now examined him under a harsher lens. Every missed rotation, every slower step, every off-court headline. Years later, legal troubles and serious accusations would place him back into headlines again, not as an athlete, but as a former star involved in controversy. Those events were covered widely by major outlets, adding another layer to the public image. Now let me be very clear. We're not here to sensationalize. We're here to understand trajectory. Because once a player transitions from future Hall of Fame potential to what went wrong, the tone shifts permanently, and that shift affects opportunities, endorsements, business ventures, legacy conversations. So here's the uncomfortable question. Should an athlete's legacy be judged primarily by his prime or by the total arc, including the decline and the headlines that followed? If you watched Kemp in the mid-90s, you saw a force, you saw power, you saw joy in the violence of competition, clean, legal, high-flying violence within the rules of the game. If you followed his later years, you saw struggle, you saw inconsistency. You saw a man carrying visible weight, both physical and reputational. And that contrast is what makes this story so compelling, because it isn't clean, it isn't a simple morality play. It's a case study in how quickly momentum can reverse. Now we've reached a turning point in this investigation. Here's a question that still splits fans who watched the 90s live. Did Shawn Kemp leave Seattle because he was already slipping? Or did Seattle let go of a superstar too soon? After the 1996 finals run, the SuperSonics were supposed to build forward. 64 regular season wins, a trip to the championship series, a core that looked young and dangerous. But behind the scenes, contract tensions were building. Kemp believed his value had risen dramatically after that finals performance. And on paper, he had a case. Multiple all-star selections, strong playoff numbers, nearly 19 points and over 10 rebounds per game during that peak stretch. He was not a sidekick, he was a co-engine. Seattle management, however, was navigating salary structure, long-term cap concerns, and internal chemistry. And here's the tricky part about that era. The NBA salary cap system was tightening. Front offices were becoming more cautious. The league was evolving financially. When Kemp expressed frustration about his contract situation, it created friction. Not a loud public war at first, more like pressure building in a sealed room. And pressure always finds an exit. Eventually, in 1997, the Sonics traded him to Cleveland in a 3-team deal. It was a shock to many fans. You don't casually trade a player who just starred in the finals, but Seattle did. Let me ask you something straight. If you're running a franchise, do you reward a player immediately after a deep playoff run? Or do you protect the organization's long-term flexibility? Because that trade changed everything. Seattle lost its aerial centerpiece. Cleveland gained a massive contract and massive expectations. And Kemp lost the system that had amplified his strengths. Was it inevitable? Or was it a fatal miscalculation by the organization? Some fans argue Seattle saw warning signs early, conditioning inconsistencies, lifestyle concerns, internal tension, and decided to move before decline became obvious. Others believe they panicked and dismantled a team that could have contended longer. Here's what makes this debate powerful. Once he left Seattle, he never again reached that same combination of dominance and chemistry. So was Seattle protecting itself from what was coming, or did they help trigger the unraveling? Drop your answer clearly. Seattle was right. Or Seattle gave up too soon, because next we step into Cleveland and the pressure cooker that followed. And this is where the money, the body, and the expectations collide head-on. When Shawn Kemp arrived in Cleveland, the message was bold. This wasn't a minor acquisition. This was a declaration. 7 years, over $100 million. In the late 90s, that deal screamed confidence. Cleveland believed they were getting a franchise anchor, a player entering his prime, a forward who had just proven himself on the biggest stage. But here's what rarely gets discussed. When you sign a player to that kind of deal, you're not just buying production, you're buying leadership, reliability, and consistency, and the Cavaliers needed all three. In his first season with Cleveland, Kemp still produced solid numbers, hovering around 18 points and nearly 10 rebounds per game. Respectable, competitive. But the visual dominance, the lift, the intimidation factor, it wasn't identical. Then came the 1998-99 lockout, a shortened season, disrupted routines, no standard off-season flow. And when camp opened, reports described Kemp arriving significantly heavier, around 30 pounds above his ideal playing condition. Now, pause for a second. How much of elite performance is skill, and how much is discipline? Because for a player whose greatest weapon was explosion, even a small physical drop can ripple across every possession. And Cleveland's gamble started to look fragile. The media narrative shifted quickly. Instead of superstar acquisition, headlines leaned toward conditioning concerns. Instead of highlight packages, analysts dissected body language. Instead of dominance, there was doubt. Now, let's be fair, Kemp still had moments. He wasn't invisible. But the sustained all-star level impact began fading. And when you're being paid like a cornerstone, fading is expensive. Financial pressure intensified. Personal obligations remained heavy. Public scrutiny increased. And when those three forces align, something usually breaks. Let me challenge you again. Was Cleveland naive to believe they were getting peak Shawn Kemp? Or did Kemp fail to meet the responsibility that came with the contract? Because that question leads directly to the next and hardest chapter. At what point does decline become irreversible? Is there a single moment when a player crosses a line and can't return? Or is it gradual erosion, so slow that by the time you notice, it's already too late? That's what we're confronting next. Every fallen superstar has a moment fans circle. For some, it's a devastating injury. For others, it's one bad contract. For Shawn Kemp, the debate is more complex. Was it the trade from Seattle? Was it the massive contract pressure? Was it the lockout disruption? Was it the lifestyle strain tied to financial and personal obligations? Or was it something deeper, something psychological? Because here's what we know. Athletes whose games rely heavily on vertical explosion age differently than those built on shooting and footwork. Once lift decreases, the margin for dominance shrinks. By the early 2000s, Kemp was no longer feared in the paint the way he had been during the finals run. His later seasons included shorter stints with different teams. The stability that once defined his Seattle era was gone. And then came years where headlines focused more on legal issues and personal controversy than basketball. That's when the public image fully transformed, not just former star, but cautionary tale. Now here's the question I want you to wrestle with honestly. Do you believe Shawn Kemp's decline was preventable? Or was it the natural arc of a player whose style burned too bright, too fast? Because prevention implies intervention. Intervention implies support, and support raises another uncomfortable layer. Where was the league? Where was the organization? Where were the advisors? In the 90s, the culture around player wellness, mental health, and financial education was far less structured than it is today. Players were expected to perform, stay in shape, and handle their own off-court lives without much transparency. Some thrived, some didn't. And Shawn Kemp became one of the most visible examples of how thin the line can be between superstardom and struggle. But here's what makes this story so powerful. Even with the decline, even with the controversies, even with the heavy financial narratives, you can't erase what he did at his peak. 32 points in a finals game, multiple all-star appearances, a 64-win season that electrified Seattle. Those moments are real. They happened. So the real debate becomes legacy, and that's where we're headed next. Close your eyes for a second and picture it. A fast break in Seattle. The crowd rising before the pass even leaves the guard's hands. Shawn Kemp takes one explosive step, elevates, and throws it down so violently that the rim seems offended. That image still lives, and that's the complication. Because legacy isn't just about what happened last. It's about what burned brightest. Statistically, Shawn Kemp's peak remains undeniable. During his prime in the mid-90s, he averaged close to 19 to 20 points per game and over 10 rebounds. He was selected to multiple All-Star games. He anchored a 64-win team. He put up 32 points in a finals opener against one of the greatest dynasties in league history. Those are not footnotes. Those are resume pillars. But then you zoom out. You see the trade, the contract tension, the conditioning concerns, the financial strain, the later headlines, and the story feels divided. So here's the real question. When you think about a player's legacy, do you anchor it to his peak or to the full arc, including the fall? Because history does both. For some fans, Shawn Kemp will always be Rain Man, the human highlight reel, the 90s power forward who brought joy and aggression to the court. For others, he represents a warning about the fragile nature of fame, how fast money and momentum can shift. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. If Seattle had won that 1996 final series, we might be telling this story very differently. One championship can rewrite perception. It can turn decline into post-prime fade. It can turn financial stress into rocky retirement. It can soften the narrative. But without that ring, the story stayed complicated. Let me ask you directly, if he had one championship, would you judge the rest of his career more gently? Be honest. Because perception isn't just about facts, it's about framing. And when we compare Kemp's story to other stars of that era, we start to see patterns that suggest he wasn't alone. The NBA of the 90s was glamorous on television and brutal behind the scenes. The travel was relentless. The physical play was punishing. The scrutiny was rising. And financial education for young stars wasn't as structured as it is now. Many players from that era faced crossroads. Some reinvented themselves. They adjusted their games as athleticism declined. They protected their finances carefully. They built tight advisory teams. Others struggled when their physical edge slipped. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Shawn Kemp's style was heavily dependent on explosion, vertical lift, power in space. When those attributes dipped, even slightly, the drop-off looked dramatic. Compare that to a player whose game relied on shooting range or footwork. They could adapt more smoothly. Now let's layer in another factor, personality. Some stars were obsessive about routine. Others thrived on emotion and intensity. Kemp was an emotional player. His game fed off adrenaline. But adrenaline doesn't solve long-term discipline. Let me challenge you. Do you think certain personalities are more vulnerable to sudden wealth and fame? Or is that an unfair generalization? Because if you examine the broader landscape of that era, you'll notice a pattern. Players with limited support systems often struggled when the spotlight dimmed. And that's where Shawn Kemp's financial obligations and personal complexity intersected with professional decline. It wasn't one dramatic collapse. It was cumulative. Now here's another question that doesn't get asked enough. Was the NBA of that era equipped to protect its young stars from themselves? Or was survival purely an individual responsibility? In today's league, players have more structured financial programs, mental health resources, and public relations guidance. Back then, much of it was trial by fire. Some made it through, some didn't. And the gap between those outcomes defines how we remember them. Which brings us to the final tension point. Can redemption reshape legacy? Or once the narrative hardens, is it permanent? Here's something powerful about sports culture in America. We love comeback stories, we celebrate reinvention, we applaud resilience, we admire honesty about struggle. But redemption requires two things: accountability and time. In later years, Shawn Kemp remained visible in different ways: business ventures, public appearances, involvement in community projects. There were also serious legal headlines that reintroduced his name to national news cycles. Each time his name resurfaced, it reignited debate, not just about what happened, but about who he is now. And this is where legacy becomes deeply personal. Because you can't undo the dunks. You can't erase the 64-win season. You can't delete the 32-point finals performance. But you also can't ignore the later chapters. So the real question becomes, are we allowed to separate the athlete from the man? Or do we insist on judging both as one complete picture? Think about your answer carefully, because it says as much about us as it does about him. Shawn Kemp's story isn't a simple rise and fall script. It's a layered arc, a risk taken at pick number 17, an explosive ascent to all-star status, a finals run that electrified a city, a massive contract that carried enormous weight, a lockout that disrupted rhythm, a body that changed, financial strain that intensified, public perception that hardened, and a legacy that still sparks debate decades later. Now I want to leave you with something reflective. If you watched the NBA in the 90s, you remember how loud it felt, how raw, how personal. That era created larger-than-life figures. Some of them adapted, some burned out, and some, like Shawn Kemp, sit right in the middle, both cautionary tale and unforgettable star. So here's the final question before we close this chapter of the investigation. If you had to define Shawn Kemp in one phrase, would you call him a superstar who fell, or a legend whose peak was simply too brief? Type your answer, because legacy isn't decided in headlines, it's decided in memory. There's a moment in every athlete's career when the eye test and the box score finally agree. At first, decline is subtle. You tell yourself it's a bad stretch. You blame a minor injury. You say the system isn't a good fit, but then the numbers begin to repeat the same message. Let's rewind to peak Shawn Kemp, mid-90s, Seattle. Around 19 to 20 points per game, double-digit rebounds, multiple all-star selections, a 64-win team built around his explosion and Gary Payton's control. That version of Kemp wasn't just productive, he was efficient and feared. Now, move forward. Cleveland era. His scoring dipped into the mid-teens at times, rebounding softened, efficiency near the rim declined, minutes fluctuated. Instead of trending upward into his late 20s, traditionally a player's prime, his impact plateaued and then began sliding. And here's what makes this more dramatic. He wasn't 34. He wasn't near retirement age. He was still in what should have been peak athletic years. That's why analysts at the time grew louder. Not because he was bad, but because the gap between expectation and reality widened. Let me ask you something direct. When decline hits earlier than expected, do you see it as physical or psychological? Because for a player whose identity was built on vertical dominance, even a small drop in lift changes everything. Defenders stop fearing the help side rotation. Guards don't hesitate to challenge at the rim. Transition finishes become contested instead of automatic. And the aura, the invisible weapon, disappears first. That's the part fans rarely measure. By the early 2000s, Shawn Kemp was no longer the player opposing coaches designed entire defensive segments around. He became part of a rotation instead of the emotional core. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The league moves fast. When a new generation of forwards enters, quicker, leaner, more positionless, yesterday's dominance fades quicker than nostalgia allows. So let me challenge you. Was Kemp's decline purely physical, or was it the result of off-court strain bleeding into performance? Because numbers don't lie, but they also don't explain. And that brings us to the next layer, reputation. The NBA spotlight doesn't dim quietly, it shifts. When Shawn Kemp was ascending, media coverage centered on electricity, power, youth, potential. When the decline narrative started forming, the language changed. Conditioning concerns, commitment questions, personal life complexity. Once those themes enter mainstream coverage, they stick. Even on nights when he played well, the commentary had a different edge. Instead of "Rainman is unstoppable," it became "Is he fully locked in?" And later, post-career legal headlines amplified that shift. Major outlets covered serious accusations tied to incidents long after his playing days. The legal process unfolded publicly. Statements were issued. Consequences followed. The specifics matter less here than the perception shift. Because once an athlete becomes associated with controversy, the old highlights no longer dominate the conversation. Now here's where I want you to be honest. Do we allow someone's later life controversy to rewrite how we view their prime? Some fans do, others refuse. But culturally, once a reputation absorbs controversy, redemption becomes harder, especially in a pre-social media era where players couldn't directly shape the narrative. And here's another angle. In the 90s, teams were less transparent about internal support systems. If a player struggled with discipline or destructive habits, it often remained inside the locker room until performance dipped enough to force exposure. And once exposure happens, image fractures. So I'll ask you again, do you believe reputation decline follows performance decline, or can it trigger it? Because when public trust erodes, pressure increases. and pressure rarely improves decision-making. Now we move to the financial core of the story, because behind the headlines and numbers sits something far more structural: the money map. Let's reconstruct the financial picture carefully. 7-year contract exceeding $100 million in the late 1990s. At the time, that placed Shawn Kemp among the highest-paid players in the league. But here's what casual observers often miss. That figure is gross income. Subtract federal taxes, subtract state taxes, subtract agent percentages, subtract management fees. The take-home shrinks quickly. Now, layer in lifestyle. Professional athletes don't live average lives. Homes scale with income. Travel scales. Social circles scale. Expectations scale. And in Kemp's case, reports consistently referenced 7 children with 6 different women. Long-term financial obligations that compound over decades. Child support agreements are not optional expenses. They are fixed commitments. Add potential business ventures, some successful, some not. Add extended family assistance. Add image maintenance. Suddenly, the gap between what you earn and what you retain narrows dramatically. And here's the psychological twist. When performance declines, income shrinks. But expenses often don't adjust immediately. That imbalance is where many athletes stumble. Over time, multiple outlets described Kemp as experiencing severe financial strain. Some used dramatic phrasing, others focused on restructuring and recovery attempts. But the pattern is clear: peak income, heavy obligations, declining contracts, sustained lifestyle. That's a dangerous equation. Now, I want your honest answer. Is financial collapse more about personal irresponsibility or about never being properly taught how to manage sudden wealth? Because in the 1990s, league-wide financial education programs were nowhere near as structured as they are today. Players learned by experience. Some adapted. Some paid for the lesson. And here's the deeper connection. Financial stress doesn't exist in isolation. It feeds mental pressure. Mental pressure feeds performance decline. Performance decline feeds media scrutiny. And the cycle tightens. Shawn Kemp's story isn't one catastrophic decision. It's accumulation. And we're not finished yet. When the cheering stops, something unexpected happens to professional athletes. It isn't silence, it's echo. For Shawn Kemp, retirement did not come with a clean emotional break. It came gradually through shorter stints, fading minutes, and diminishing spotlight. One day you are the emotional engine of a 64-win contender. A few seasons later, you are adjusting to life without a structured schedule, without nightly competition, without thousands of people reacting to your every move. And that transition can be far more destabilizing than fans realize. Because for more than a decade, Kemp's identity had been crystal clear. He was the explosive power forward who brought energy and intimidation to every arena. His value was measurable in points, rebounds, and the reaction of the crowd. After basketball, that measurement disappears. In the years following his playing career, Kemp explored different ventures, including business efforts and community involvement. There were attempts to reframe his image and establish a new public role that did not rely on highlight reels from the mid-90s. That is not unusual. Many former players look for ways to remain relevant, not out of vanity, but because relevance once defined their daily life. However, public reinvention is complicated when old narratives linger. If financial strain has already been reported, if conditioning decline is part of the story, if later legal headlines reintroduce your name into national media cycles, then every new venture is viewed through that lens. Instead of a former star building a second chapter, the framing often becomes, can he recover? That framing matters. Because once the conversation shifts from achievement to recovery, the psychological weight increases. Let me ask you something that doesn't get discussed enough. When an athlete retires, do we expect them to reinvent themselves flawlessly? Or do we secretly enjoy watching whether they stumble? It's an uncomfortable question, but it's honest. American sports culture celebrates comeback stories, but it also consumes cautionary tales. And sometimes those two impulses collide. For Kemp, post-career life included moments of renewed visibility, but also moments where controversy overshadowed reinvention. The balance between those two forces has never fully stabilized in the public memory. And that leads us directly into a deeper debate. Because once a career takes this kind of arc, responsibility becomes a contested issue. Was it personal failure, organizational mismanagement, cultural pressure, or some mixture of all three? There is a temptation to simplify complex stories into clean moral lessons, poor decisions, bad influences, wasted talent. But reality rarely fits into one sentence. Shawn Kemp entered the league at 19 years old, drafted 17th overall in 1989. Within a few seasons, he was part of one of the most dynamic duos in basketball, playing under bright national television lights and carrying the expectations of an entire city. That kind of acceleration changes a person. By the time he signed a contract exceeding $100 million, he was still in his 20s. The financial leap was enormous. The public scrutiny intensified. The league itself was in transition, moving into a more commercial and globally televised era. Now consider the environment. In the mid-90s, structured financial education for rookies was far less robust than it is today. Mental health resources were not openly discussed. Player development was focused overwhelmingly on performance, not sustainability. Teams expected production, discipline, and public composure. But the infrastructure supporting those expectations was thinner than modern fans might assume. So here's the central tension. When a young athlete struggles under massive wealth and pressure, is that purely personal responsibility, or does the system share some accountability? Some argue that professional sports is a meritocracy, that high compensation comes with total responsibility, and that maturity is part of the job description. Others counter that when you draft teenagers into a billion-dollar industry, surround them with opportunity and temptation, and then step back, you cannot pretend the structure is neutral. In Kemp's case, we see the collision of explosive talent, rapid fame, financial obligation, and evolving league culture. His physical decline during the lockout period is often cited as the turning point, but that moment did not occur in isolation. It followed years of mounting pressure, lifestyle expansion, and increasing scrutiny. This is not about removing agency. It is about acknowledging complexity. And complexity makes for uncomfortable conclusions. So I want you to take a position here. If you had to assign responsibility as a percentage, how much belongs to Shawn Kemp personally, and how much belongs to the environment around him? 50-50, 70-30, 90-10? There is no universally accepted answer, and that uncertainty feeds directly into the final structural question of this investigation. What parts of this story are solid fact, and what parts have been amplified by television storytelling over the years? Television thrives on arcs, rise, peak, fall, lesson. But real careers are rarely that clean. Let's anchor ourselves in verified points. Shawn Kemp was drafted 17th overall in 1989. He became a multi-time All-Star in the mid-90s. He helped lead a Seattle team to 64 wins and an NBA Finals appearance in 1996. He scored 32 points in Game 1 of that final series. Seattle lost the series 4-2. He later signed a contract reported at over $100 million with Cleveland. During the lockout-shortened season, reports widely described him as arriving at camp significantly heavier than his listed playing weight. His statistical production declined in the following seasons. Financial strain and legal controversy became part of his later public narrative. Those points are grounded in documented reporting and historical records. Now comes the layer television often intensifies. The idea that one habit explains everything, the suggestion that one season destroyed a career, the framing of a single contract as a fatal choice. In reality, careers erode gradually. Bodies change incrementally. Finances tighten over time. Public perception evolves in waves. Television compresses that into drama because drama holds attention, but compression can distort nuance. So here's the reflective question that matters most. When you think about Shawn Kemp's story, are you reacting to the documented timeline or to the dramatic version shaped by years of commentary? Because the truth sits somewhere between highlight reels and cautionary headlines, and we're almost at the end of this journey. If you study careers long enough, you start to notice something. The breaking point is rarely loud. It isn't the finals loss, it isn't the contract signing, it isn't even the lockout weight gain that dominated headlines. The real breaking point usually hides inside a quieter decision, a moment when a player either adjusts or resists adjustment. For Shawn Kemp, that moment likely arrived during the early Cleveland years, when the signs were visible, but the decline was not yet irreversible. His scoring had dipped from peak levels, but he was still averaging in the mid to high teens. His rebounding remained respectable. His name still carried weight across the league. He was not finished. He was at a crossroads. At that stage, a full recommitment to conditioning, a restructuring of financial management, and a deliberate reshaping of lifestyle could have altered the arc. Other players have done it. Veterans have reinvented themselves by losing weight, refining skill sets, adjusting diet, restructuring finances, and rebuilding their circle. But reinvention requires acceptance, and acceptance is often the hardest step for elite athletes. Because to reinvent, you must admit that the old version of you is gone. And that is a brutal admission for someone whose identity was built on being unstoppable. Think about the psychological weight of that realization. In 1996, Shawn Kemp was a finals-level force, scoring 32 points in the opener against the Bulls and averaging over 23 points across the series. Within a few years, analysts were questioning conditioning and long-term durability. That contrast is sharp. So here is the uncomfortable question. If you have built your life around being physically dominant, how do you emotionally process the moment when dominance fades? Some athletes channel that into obsessive reinvention. Others struggle to recalibrate. The league does not slow down while you figure it out. By the early 2000s, the NBA had already begun evolving toward faster spacing and new archetypes. Younger, leaner forwards were entering the league. The margin for adjustment narrowed. And once the narrative of decline solidifies publicly, it compounds pressure. Every game becomes a referendum. Every misstep confirms the storyline. This is why the breaking point matters. It is not about blame. It is about timing. There was a window when the story could have shifted from decline to reinvention. That window did not fully materialize into a comeback. And once that window closes, history accelerates. So I ask you plainly, do you believe Shawn Kemp ever truly confronted that moment? Or did the momentum of his early identity carry him too far to pivot in time? Because that answer shapes how we close this story. And now we arrive at the final chapter. When the history of the 1990s NBA is told, certain images always resurface. Michael Jordan's poise, Hakeem Olajuwon's footwork, Karl Malone's durability, and in Seattle, the violent grace of Shawn Kemp rising above traffic. That image is permanent. But history is not a photograph. It is a composite. Shawn Kemp will be remembered as the 17th pick in 1989 who exceeded expectations and became a multi-time All-Star. He will be remembered as the co-anchor of a 64-win Seattle powerhouse that pushed Chicago in the 1996 finals. He will be remembered for 32 points in Game 1 of that series, for ferocious rebounds, for dunks that rattled both rim and broadcast commentary. He will also be remembered for the massive Cleveland contract, the lockout weight concerns, the statistical decline that followed, the financial strain that later entered public discussion, and the legal headlines that complicated his post-career narrative. Both realities coexist. That is not contradiction, that is legacy. And perhaps that is the most honest way to frame it. Shawn Kemp's story is neither a simple tragedy nor a simple cautionary tale. It is a vivid example of how extraordinary talent can elevate a player quickly, and how sustainability demands a different set of skills entirely. He did not vanish into irrelevance. His name still sparks debate decades later. That alone tells you something about impact. But here is the final defining question I want you to wrestle with. When you introduce the 1990s NBA to someone younger, do you present Shawn Kemp as the explosive force who electrified arenas, or as the lesson about how fragile momentum can be? Because your answer determines the lens through which his career survives. Legacy is not decided by headlines alone. It is decided by memory. And memory, especially in sports, is selective. So here is the last question of this entire investigation. Is Shawn Kemp, in your eyes, a superstar who burned too bright, or a legend whose fall simply became part of the story? Write it in the comments, because history listens.